Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about the 2024 season's car balance issues. Did you know that there is a problem on the grid regarding car balance? You might have heard about it from drivers and/or teams, especially during recent races. Well, I read the article Red Bull's Monster to Ferrari's Bouncing: What's Behind F1's Car Balance Problems on motorsport.com and found it very interesting. So I asked Dick to unpack this issue. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, I really like that I can read articles and talk to you about them, talk to John about them, and you can give me insight. So here's a problem that is on the grid that I'm hearing about called car balance. We're hearing it from drivers, especially in the most recent races. And the article that I read was titled Red Bull's Monster to Ferrari's Bouncing: What's Behind F1's Car Balance Problems, and motorsport.com. That's where I found it. I found it very interesting and I wanted to get your take. And specifically, this is the quote that I think would be a really good starting point for you to teach me and our listeners. Okay?
Sure.
Quote, each team has experienced a near identical scenario of delivering a car upgrade that brings with it extra downforce, but with it the side effect of an altered car handling to make it feel worse from the cockpit. That so many teams have been struck down by this is no coincidence, because the extra performance being added this year has exposed some inherent technical challenges with the current ground effect cars. And central to all is the way that 2 performance factors dominate the handling. This is the varying downforce levels produced at different speeds as the car is pushed. The car is closer to the ground, allied to how the tire temperatures are impacted throughout the lap. Both of these elements are dynamic and are forcing teams to chase the least worst compromise rather than seek a perfect solution. So when I read this quote, I thought, wow, there's a lot of terms that I know because of all the things that you've discussed and taught. And then also I've heard some of these terms during the commentary of the races or free practice or quali. And so I wanted to see if you could unpack this issue and specifically the challenge teams are facing that this article is addressing.
Well, it's a fascinating article. It's a fascinating problem that apparently all the teams are suffering from. And I can certainly appreciate what it is that they're fighting with. So let's lay a little bit of groundwork before we actually dive into what the factors are that are at play. All right. And so the first thing is when they talk about balance, they're not talking about how much weight is on the front of the car versus how much weight's on the rear of the car or from side to side or whatever. When they talk about balance, what they're really talking about is the characteristics of the car. In other words, does it understeer, does it oversteer, or is it neutral steering? And if it understeers, is it just a little bit understeer? Is it a whole lot? Same thing with oversteer, all right? So they're talking about that balance. And, we've talked about this before, but most drivers, a Lewis Hamilton or a Fernando Alonso, they're going to want a car that when they turn into the corner, there's maybe just a little bit of understeer. The rear end is planted, gives them a little bit of a secure feeling, I guess is the best way to put it. And then when they get to the middle of the corner, or what we call the apex of the corner, in very simplistic terms, the car kind of goes neutral. And then as they apply power to exit the corner, the car turns into having a little bit of oversteer, which is the tail end is sliding just a little bit. And that's what these guys are really comfortable with. Now, there's notable exceptions, Max Verstappen being number one. He kind of likes it oversteering everywhere. He wants the tail end sliding on the way in and then all the way out of the corner. The thing that's interesting is that you absolutely have to have a car that is oversteering a little bit coming out of a corner as opposed to understeering. It's just Oversteer is just a little bit quicker on the exit of the corner. You can make an argument that maybe oversteer on the entry to a corner is faster because Max has certainly made it work. But on the other hand, Lewis and Fernando make a car that is a little understeery going into the corner. They make a good case for it there as well. So it really comes down to driver preference by that stage. But regardless, you don't want a whole bunch of understeer or a whole bunch of oversteer wherever you are in the corner. A little bit one way or the other based on driver preference is what you want. Okay, so that's kind of setting the table, so to speak, for what handling balance looks like. Now, we've had a number of conversations in the past, and if our listeners haven't had the opportunity to check them out, then I would say go in and give our conversation around Aerodynamics 101. That talks a lot about just how ground effect cars work, how wings work, all those kinds of things. We've also had conversations around suspensions and the need to keep the aerodynamic platform level, which we're going to talk a little bit about here this evening. But that will give you a little bit more in-depth knowledge. And I think that will also help our listeners have a better understanding of some of the conversation that we're having tonight, because I can start geeking out on this and might as well be, speaking Russian or something, or Chinese, because unless you know what I'm talking about, it's pretty tough to imagine what's going on with these cars. So with all that being said, the real issues that have been driven by these cars is that they had to learn about them in the 22 season when they were brand new. And if you can remember, there was a lot of trouble with porpoising and all that, and they had to get a handle on that. We'll talk a little bit about porpoising in just a minute. But as the engineers have gotten smarter and as the game has evolved into a game of competitive aerodynamics, which Formula One has always been that way, but right now with the ground effect cars, it really is about competitive aerodynamics. Some engineers reckon that they have gained 45% more downforce in 2024 than what they had in 2022. And so what that means is that the cars stick to the ground way better than what they had done before. And the thing about a ground effect car is the faster you go and the lower you ride the car. In other words, the gap between the belly of the car and the road surface, the more narrow that gap is, the more downforce you make. And the more downforce you make, the more the car wants to compress on its springs, because obviously you're producing more downforce. And it's literally, at some point, the car is literally sucking itself into the road. And if you're not careful, it'll just grind the belly off of the car. Okay. And so they are forced then, as engineers, race engineers, they've got to come up with a way of maintaining a ride height that's as close to the road as possible without the car actually touching the ground. All right. And so what you're really looking for is keeping the aerodynamic platform of the car, which is the front wing, the floor, and the rear wing. That's the aerodynamic platform. You want to keep it as constant as possible, parallel with the road surface, while dealing with these widely different downforce levels, depending upon the speed of the car. In other words, if you don't have a whole lot of downforce on the car, you may have 1.5 inches of ground clearance, let's say. So the car's not going to be making much downforce. You're going slow, car's not making much downforce. Then as you pick up speed and you're going down the straightaway, the car's making more and more and more downforce. And so the car naturally settles on its suspension and gets closer and closer to the road. It makes more and more downforce. And so pretty soon you're making your maximum downforce in exactly the spot that you don't need it, which is down the straightaway. Where you need the maximum downforce is in the corners. And so when the driver lets off the gas for a corner and steps on the brake, the car slows down. It also rises up off of its suspension, and a bunch of that downforce goes away. And depending on how the floor is designed, more downforce goes away from the front than the rear, or vice versa. And so if you lose more downforce at the front, then now you have a back end that feels planted, but you may have a car that's understeering quite a bit. In other words, the front tires are wanting to slide away from the inside of the corner. On the other hand, it's very possible that if the center of aerodynamic pressure is more towards the front of the car. Well, as the pressure goes away, then all of a sudden the front of the car is pinned and you have more grip at the front than you do at the rear. So the car is going to slide or oversteer going through the corner. So this is where the compromise that they talked about the least worst compromise, this is where it really starts to get tricky, because you got two ways of keeping that car relatively safe from grinding its belly off the surface of the road. One is you can add stiffer springs, which then harm your mechanical grip, which you've got to have in the low speed corners, or you can go with a higher ride height, which kills your downforce, or you can compromise by coming up with some sort of a balance between spring stiffness and ride height to get that height where it needs to be and the stiffness of the suspension where it needs to be, so that they can work in harmony to get your closest compromise, based on the idea that, I don't have a track with a bunch of bumps or anything like that, which then makes it even more complicated, because then you need the soft springs to keep the car from bouncing off the bumps and all that kind of stuff. And yet at the same time as the car produces downforce, you need stiff springs to keep it off the road. So the engineers are having to do this amazing kind of dance to get the car to act properly. And so what happens then is that because of this, when you're going down the long straightaway and you're producing maximum downforce and the car raises off the ground, now all of a sudden you have a car that the driver's really not sure how pinned the front end or the rear end is going to be, as the case may be. And then as the car starts settling and you start accelerating out of the corner, well, guess what? You're speeding up, you're producing more downforce. Now, all of a sudden, it's sticking in a different direction. So it's very likely that you could have a car that, oversteers into the corner and understeers out, or vice versa. And so it's really becomes a really delicate dance. And this is why you hear about these flexi front wings, right? The idea being is that they design it so that the wing will pass the various stiffness tests that are mandated by the FIA. But when aerodynamic load is put on them, these wings actually lay down as they go down the straightaway, creating less drag and less downforce. And then when the driver lets off and the car slows down, the wing pops back up into the height that it was originally designed to be at, so that it's producing more downforce to therefore make up for the lost downforce that the floor is losing because the car has raised. So that's the other piece, and that's why everybody's been chasing the flexible wings. You may recall last year when Aston Martin at the beginning of the season, they were fantastic. They got to Monaco, FIA was on to them about the flexible front wing and said, yeah, great idea, boys. You can't run that anymore. And so they had to redesign their wing. And guess what? Aston Martin lost a lot of competitiveness because they didn't have a flexible front wing that was working nearly like what it had been. That's basically what's going on. And you can see it's an incredible engineering task to go to a specific racetrack. You think about a street circuit like a Monaco or Singapore or Baku, any of those places would have such different characteristics. And then you have a situation where you have other tracks like a Monza or a Silverstone, very different characteristics again, or Austria, another one. Every time, man, they're having to come up with that compromise, and some of the tracks are going to have, pretty close setups to compared to others. But in others, they're pretty unique, I think. Anyway, that's kind of the deal. Does that make sense?
It does. I got a couple of follow-ups. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So when you said it'll change with every race, every circuit, and I feel like I remember you saying that during our Aero 101 conversation when you gave us the much more in-depth of this, the teams will use their historical data to determine things like ride height and the springs that are going to be necessary. And so This year we've seen a few of the tracks have resurfaced or changed different things. That also creates a variable for the teams of trying to and making their calculations for this. So that also goes back to this car balance that you're talking about.
Right.
Okay.
It absolutely does. Yeah.
Okay. Then on this, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, and I was just going to say, you could go from one year to the next And for whatever reason, the air density, in the second year that you're at a particular track, the air density is much less. And if that air density goes down, okay, you've got to make an aerodynamic change right there to get the numbers back that these guys are looking for, because lower air density means that the car is going to produce at any given setting, it's going to produce less downforce.
Right. I do remember you saying how impactful air density is, because that's something I think I asked you when it came to Mexico City.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. The
Yep.
pieces are slowly coming together in my brain.
You're doing good.
Okay. So when you talk about the flexi wing, and I know that that's also been a whole bunch of articles in the last few weeks people have been talking about, is this idea that this innovative idea of at certain points it pops up, comes down? That's in my brain. I don't know if those are the terms that you use.
Yep.
Is that something we see in airplanes when we're looking at the wing, when certain aspects of it pops, like if you're looking out the window when the plane is flying?
Well, I mean, it's kind of sort of, but it's for a different reason.
Okay.
If you look at an airliner, for example, when it taxis out, the wing tips are actually drooping just a little bit. And then as the airplane picks up speed to take off, you'll notice that the wings actually straighten out and eventually have a little bit of a bow to them, because of, just the enormous weight that those wings are carrying. On another way of thinking about it, if you want to use the airplane analogy, it would be a little bit like the ailerons, which are the control surfaces that control roll on an airplane moving up and down. Obviously, the pilot's controlling that, whereas on these flexible wings that are on an F1 car, it's not controlled by the driver. It's not controlled by anything other than the speed of the air that's flowing over them.
And then this idea of the flexi wings, is that what we see when we look even at birds and how their wings and how they move, that micro movements as a bird is flying in the air?
That's a great question. I'm not an ornithologist, but it would make sense that it would, certainly, because they have the same, directional control issues that an airplane would have around three axes, right? Roll, pitch, and yaw. So, race cars, they've certainly got roll and yaw. They do have pitch, but you sure wouldn't want very much of it, because pitch would assume you're taking off in a race car. And
right.
It doesn't work very well.
Right. We do not want that. That's not what we're really attempting to achieve. And then lastly, on this point, why did the FIA say no to flexi wings? It seems like that would be a good thing for the teams to be able to innovate and push. Or does that go back to the problem many years ago that they were concerned about relating to something? I can't remember what it was called right now, but I just remember you saying decades ago there was a thing related to aero on a car that you could pop a switch and it could just hurl the cars off the track.
Yeah, it's basically what you're thinking of is there's always been a rule ever since 1969 about movable aerodynamic surfaces, and engineers have always tried to find a way around that rule. But what you're speaking of is that there literally had these wings that were mounted in such a way that the driver could flip a switch and the wing would go with a little electric motor would go flat when they were going down the straightaway. So it wasn't creating much downforce, wasn't creating much drag either. And then when they got near the corner, they'd flip a switch and the angle of the wing would increase, which meant the drag goes up, the downforce goes up, and they go around the corner. So in many respects, I mean, this is a great catch on your part. The flexi wing is trying to do that without having the switch in the motor.
Well, this is helpful. So then let me ask you kind of touched on it earlier, but I want to unpack it a little bit more. All of this car balance issue, how does it impact the driver, like physically and even mentally? I think you've touched on it a little bit mentally, but can you go a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're not completely convinced what your car is going to do, then as a driver, you need to be confident in what your car is going to do. It needs to be repeatable. And these cars, apparently, their handling is not necessarily repeatable. It doesn't have just a little tad of understeer going into a corner and a little tad of oversteer coming out, or whatever the case may be. You'd really like it to do that everywhere. And these cars don't. And furthermore, the degree of understeer and oversteer changes as well, depending on the corner and all sorts of things. And so apparently these cars just don't inspire a lot of confidence in their drivers, right? And because they tend to switch from understeer to oversteer pretty rapidly, and it catches the drivers out. And And once it catches the drivers out, then they get reluctant to push right out to the very edge of the performance envelope, right? And because when they do, the car kind of breaks away without a whole lot of warning and they stuff it into the fence. I mean, we kind of saw this with Fernando in Imola. I mean, Fernando rarely makes a mistake where he goes off the track in a big way. But in Imola, he sure did, went way out into the gravel track and all that. And it was because the car responded in a way that he wasn't expecting. And so, that was really, in my mind, beyond the porpoising that we saw. That's really what's happened, The other part is from a physical standpoint, if a car is porpoising a lot, it's bouncing up and down on the springs because the downforce is, getting very high, and then the car truly bottoms out and the downforce goes away because all the air has left the bottom of the car. So it goes up off the springs because the downforce has gone away, and then the downforce builds again and it smashes into the road. And so it's just like a pogo stick practically. And so there's a lot of drivers who have complained about having a lot of back pain and all that. They're having to deal with their physio a whole lot more often.
That's true, because you're the complaints about back pain, and you have to wonder the residual that I'll be feeling during summer, during the various break periods.
Right.
I guess I was thinking, as you said it, kind of like when you ride a roller coaster. When you're a kid, you don't think about it as much, but as we get older and you feel it, and you're going, "Oh, I felt that the next day."
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, wow. I can't really imagine what the drivers are facing when this is happening. And as you said, the mental aspect of pushing, but you feel like the car is like a bucking bronco almost at you. That's what yeah. Okay. Well,
Yep.
so then that leads me to the next question. And I feel like you touched on it, but I want to unpack it a little bit more, which is, how is this actually impacting the racing? I'm asking because I have to wonder, with every race being a different circuit or track and variables like things like the air density, but weather, the tire deg, you have to take those into consideration for every race. Does the car balance issue, does that become a significant problem that can lead to chasing solutions, all while you're trying to optimize your car through the traditional development process of the year? Do you see where I'm kind of leading on
Oh
that?
yeah, for sure. I mean, what the race engineers at the track are telling the engineers back at the factory, and the driver input and all that kind of stuff. Oh my gosh, it's got to be amazingly complex, and that's why they run through so many different scenarios in the simulator overnight between, let's say, free practice 2 and free practice 3, right? Friday to Saturday. We talked with our friend Jack Crawford, and he talked about how when he's not racing in F2, he's one of the guys in the Aston Martin simulator back at the factory trying out different combinations and solutions so that then the race engineers can say, okay, this seemed to work on the simulator. Let's try this out, Fernando or Lance, and let's see how you go. One of those kind of deals. So, yeah, I mean, it becomes very much like that old deal that was called the Rubik's Cube. You make one change over on one side and everything else gets messed up on the other side, or you make one change and everything lines up and it's perfect. So that's the best analogy that I can have. I mean, the more drivable your car, the better your chances are in the race, right? You're going to be able to drive more consistency and all that. One of the issues also that if the balance of the aero is out of whack, that will cause your tires to overheat. For example, if your downforce is such that you don't have enough downforce on the front of the car, your front tires are going to start sliding a little bit. They'll overheat, and then they're going to begin to lose grip. They're going to slide more, in other words, you're going to have understeer, and it'll just increase throughout the stint. So you've got to get that aero balance right as well to preserve the life of the tire and not overheat them from a whole bunch of sliding. With all that said, I found a quote by Aston Martin's engineer Luca Verbato, and he really summed it up very nicely about the challenge that these guys have. And I'll just read it to you because I love this. There is difficulty of these cars in turning in the corner entry phase. Let's say that the aerodynamic platform helps to find the load on the rear to the detriment of the front during the various phases of the turn. Therefore, you can go from a neutral car on entry that becomes understeering before the apex and then becomes very oversteering on exit. This transaction, which in the past was never so extreme, is becoming increasingly clear because these cars are reaching very high downforce load values. That tells it all, and so you can go from a car that seems very stable to one that's got a little bit of understeer right when you don't want it, which is right right in the middle of the corner, and it's trying to push you away from the inside of the turn. And then when you get to the exit, all of a sudden the car snaps to oversteer. It's not very fast. It looks dramatic. We saw that in Baku, right? The guys were sliding all over the place, and it was fun to watch, but it's a handful for the drivers, and it's actually not very fast.
I really like that quote, and I like the way that you tied it into Baku. Also, when you say it's not fast, it's also got to be, even though these guys are trained, they're the top of the field, there has to be a level that the adrenaline and the only word I can think of is terror, but I know they're not terrified in the car. They feel a level of oneness with the car, but that just wrestling, fighting that machine to do this, that's got to be so rough. And then places like Singapore and Baku, where you've got those walls, all the more, I have such an appreciation for what the guys are doing this year. Now hearing from you, unpacking this issue from that article about car balance. I wish that we could understand truly what they're going through, because I think we would have even greater appreciation for what they're dealing with. But I'm glad to have conversations like this that at least helps us, those of us non-racers who are sitting on a couch and thinking, oh, you should have done this. Well, this is what they're fighting against or trying to control or harness, maybe is a better word. So thank you, Dick. I appreciate this.
Yeah, I think that for our listeners, if you're able to do it, maybe the best way to approximate what it might feel like in a corner is if you can go to a go-kart track where they have the rental carts, if somehow you could talk the owner of the track into just getting one of the corners wet with water and drive on slicks, that's kind of what it feels like. I mean, it's going to be exaggerated, but you'll see what it feels like to turn in to a corner, you have grip, and then all of a sudden, you hit the wet patch and suddenly you don't have grip. That's the only analogy that I can come up with that might give the listener an idea of how you could kind of sort of replicate it, of what it might feel like.
Okay, well, if anybody's going to go do that, let us know. Send us video. That would be so much fun. Or write it up. Tell us what you thought the experience was like, and if that gave you more empathy towards any of the racers that we are watching.
I may be stupid enough to try that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's not stupid. It's a great. Yeah, do it, and put it on your channel, the Begin Again channel. Then we would love that. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, Professor, for this tutorial on car balance, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.